All right, folks, so I realized that the first video of this is recorded with my face, so I'm going to attempt to do this without my face so that you can see the whole slide. I apologize for the previous one. If you would like me to send you the link of the actual PowerPoint, I am happy to do that. So we talked about the cycle of energy. We're now going to talk about the cycle of matter. Closed system, nothing is created or destroyed. We call them the biogeochemical cycles. These are going to be like the water cycle and the carbon cycle. And so all of these different factors within this image that you're seeing right now are going to contain these different chemicals and cycle them through in some way. If you look, they exist in both living and non-living forms. If you look at the very base, where there's the abiotic reservoir and the geologic processes, that's the stored carbon and water and everything that exists in its abiotic form. Once it becomes available to producers as stuff in the soil, it then can be converted into living or biotic factors. Right, technically I am made up of carbon. I am considered living, even though that carbon at one point existed as an abiotic factor. And so the thing to remember is that in a biogeochemical cycle, the matter can exist as both biotic and abiotic factors. It's never created or destroyed. First system you need to know is the nitrogen cycle. What is important here to know is that nitrogen exists in the atmosphere. It is N2, which is gas. It is actually more common than oxygen. Where does it go after that? It gets incorporated into the soil by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Specifically, these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, you see them on the left side of this image, are basically on the root nodules of legumes, which are like beans and things like that. We also just see nitrogen-fixing soil bacteria. These are just bacteria in the soil. How else does it get into the soil? It gets into the soil through fecal matter. We see our little gopher. It also gets into the soil from plants, through the animal into the soil, also through decomposers, different fungi and stuff like that. They all will put that gaseous nitrogen and they fix it into what we call ammonia, and it goes through the process called ammonification. Ammonia is not usable to a lot of organisms besides bacteria, and we see that after it enters the soil through nitrogen-fixing bacteria, fecal matter, different plants, different fungi, it becomes ammonia first, NH4+. Then it goes through nitrification, which is done by nitrifying bacteria, and it becomes nitrites and nitrates. These nitrites and nitrates are then usable by either plants or denitrifying bacteria. If it's used by plants, it'll enter back into the soil as ammonia and then cycle through that. If it is used, right, those nitrites and nitrates, if it is used by denitrifying bacteria, the denitrifying bacteria remove the oxygen from the nitrogens and it becomes N2 gas again. In the phosphorus cycle, phosphorus is going to hang out in rocks pretty often. We see that there's basically two ways that phosphorus cycles. It is usually in mountains and like cliffs and things like that. It is released through weathering of phosphate from the rocks. Once that weathering occurs, so wind, sandblasting, snow, any sort of geological movement, it's going to end up in runoff through rain and rivers and things like that. Once it gets into the runoff, it's going to enter, and again, this is on the right side of the image. Once it gets into the runoff, eventually it will reach some sort of large body of water. It's going to become phosphorus in solution, which we call phosphate. It precipitates and settles at the bottom. Eventually, it will become new rock. I mean, over millions of years, because sedimentation involves the compaction of soil into rock. Eventually, if those lakes or bodies of water disappear, we see new rock forming. The other way that this occurs is that if it ends up in the water in the soil, it can be taken up by plants and animals and decomposers. If there's phosphate in the soil, it can be recycled right back into the plant for use, and it'll stay there. It's very useful in that sense. Some plants really need phosphorus to survive. The water cycle. Hopefully we know this one. This is where our water is traveling. This is kind of the short version. We see that precipitation, the falling of water from clouds, either as rain or snow or hail or sleet or any sort of water coming from the clouds. There's a couple ways that it can end up back in the clouds. The most common one is evaporation from the sea. This happens all the time. If there is precipitation over land, we see that that soil, some of it ends up, some of the water ends up in the soil. It can run off into the ocean and then evaporates back into the clouds, or it can end up in the bodies of water, right? We see it traveling into the groundwater and coming up into the bodies of water, and through evapotranspiration, it can end up back in the clouds. And so these are very simple. Hopefully we recognize a lot of these terms. Carbon cycle. This one is the most studied as of late because we are quickly polluting our air through the carbon cycle. The issue is that we are producing a lot of CO2 through the burning of wood and fossil fuels, also the use of cars, and there are not enough plants to process it back into carbon and oxygen separately, right? We know that CO2 is used by a plant, creates sugar, which has carbon in it, and oxygen, which we need. That is kind of a huge problem, is that we're building up an excess of CO2. Plants are not capable of processing are not capable of photosynthesizing fast enough. This is basically the journey of the carbon molecule. If it is CO2, it will be used by a plant. The problem is that we can only break down CO2 using plants. There's no other way. Once a plant creates the sugar molecule and the oxygen, the sugar molecule, C6H12O6, right, sugar, chemical compound sugar, it is either incorporated directly into the soil and microbes use it, or primary consumers are going to eat it. If it is in the soil, it is basically consumed by soil microbes. It is put back into the air and becomes CO2. If it is used by other plants, it also becomes CO2. If my primary consumer is consumed by a high-level consumer, eventually it still ends up in the air as CO2. And as we can see, the big issue is that no matter how the carbon is consumed, it is put out as CO2 into the atmosphere, and so the plants have a really big job of processing it from multiple different places. So the idea of nutrient cycling, and we talked about this, the idea that sometimes our nutrients are available as biotic factors. Sometimes they are not available, they are abiotic factors, and these are essentially the arrows indicate the processes that bring it from biotic to abiotic or abiotic to biotic. Did I say that appropriately? Anyway, you get the picture. The idea that it makes it either usable or not usable. If we look at the very base, we see atmosphere, soil, water. If there are nutrients available there, they're available, right? I can use them if they're in my water, in my soil, in my atmosphere. If these are compacted into sedimentary rock, they become minerals in the rocks. They are unavailable anymore. To get them available, weathering and erosion need to occur, and that's our bottom two boxes. If we look at the blue box again, atmosphere, soil, water, where nutrients are available, the way that I get at those is either doing photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, excretion. Those make the compounds that are in the atmosphere, the soil, and the water usable in another sense. Usually it incorporates them into a living thing. If we're in the green box, I can become unusable if I am fossilized into, I become a fossil and eventually become coal, oil, or peat, or something like that. Feel free to ask me to give an example of this if you find this image confusing. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different organisms that show up and energy uses and things like that. What's important here is that we have endotherms and we have ectotherms. And so when we talk about energy, our organisms utilize energy in two different ways, essentially. Ignore our unicellular organisms because they are a little bit weird about how they process energy. Endotherms are going to be our warm-blooded organisms, our organisms that maintain an internal core temperature. Our ectotherms are going to be what we call cold-blooded, or maintain a temperature that is more similar to their outside environment. Reptiles are the most common example. We would be endotherms. When we think about ectotherms versus endotherms versus ectotherms, we talk about the energy return on investment. Basically, how much energy do I put out every time I'm trying to gain food or energy, and how much energy do I get back from that? And when we are talking about an endotherm, right, us humans, we're going to put in a lot of energy to kind of break even. We require a lot of energy to basically just maintain our health, grow, store food, reproduce, protect ourselves. And so we find that the return on investment, the amount of energy that we get back, kind of breaks even because we're investing so much energy in pursuing the things that we need. We'll find that ectotherms, right, our frogs, things like that, they are going to have a much higher return on their investment. They put very little energy into what they need. They get a whole lot of energy back. This is also due to the fact that all they need to do is move to a different area to adjust their core temperature. If it's very sunny, I'm going to sit in the shade. My temperature regulates itself. We as mammals have to work very hard to maintain a regulated temperature. I have to sweat, I have to shiver, I've got to do a lot of things to stay in a normal temperature range. So now that we've examined the flows of energy and the cycling of matter, so we've talked about energy, talked about matter, we're going to examine the biomes, and knowledge of each of these biomes is important. I wouldn't know every single detail about them, but I would make sure that you are familiar with each of them. I'm going to pause here and then we'll watch the last clip. That will be just about the biomes and then you will be done.